go. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Winter, and this is fractalu.com, fractalfield.com, and we're having the warm-up conversation. Shelley is here with us, and we're talking with Teresa Burns, who is our guest special speaker tonight. And Teresa was just telling us about the other book she was working on about the Kachinas. And could you just give us a short, like what is a Kachina in your view compared to what is an Ophanim or something like that?
Well, okay, sure. And I want to say also, this is an art history book. It's not an esoteric book. So, but
Shelley's writing the definitive book about.
No,
Teresa is.
I would not. I'm not Native American. I wouldn't. But my friend Alex Ciautua, who died in 2014, the same year as Vincent Bridges, he and his sons, one of whom is my co-author, Kenneth Ciautua, painted murals inside the old Spanish mission in the Zuni Pueblo in New Mexico. And they started in the 70s. It was a 30-year project. The mission is closed now and crumbling. So this book is really the only record now. I mean, tourists would go in and see it, but the idea was, as Alex put it, to have a library for my people. And the Kokos, which is the Zuni word for Kachina, are the person who puts on that regalia is personating, not impersonating, but you might think of it as the same as a spirit indwells an Egyptian statue. And so they're what is represented on the wall there is their Shalako procession, which is the big celebration in December. And so yeah, that's that. I was telling Dan before we started, I'm trying to finish that book before I start my lessons on the hieroglyphic monad and Enochian, which is what I'm talking about here today. But I didn't know that Shelley was an expert on Kachinas.
Shelley is a part indigenous yourself, right? Shelley is that, yeah. Shelley has some Native American.
Yes. And you had mentioned the Manahunis, but that's actually the Hawaiian little people, like the equivalent of the leprechaun.
Right, so, the leprechauns, yes.
Yeah. And so, but different from then what Terry's talking about a little bit,
Right.
Yeah. But and like the Shalako, for example, is the main Shalako is like a 10-foot tall blue bird person, kind of. So without, and I think it'd probably be inappropriate for me to talk about how it might or might not connect to the Ophanim, but I will say that Alan the three that we talk to as intermediaries are tall blue people, humanoid beings, but that's about all I want to say.
You talk to.
Yeah.
Yes, and so shades of Return of the Bird Tribes, or Dahani Wahoo saying the Cherokee name for Ophanim is Adawi, or
I think all these things start echoing against each other a whole lot. Now, I want to be clear, like, I don't think it has anything overtly to do with the hieroglyphic monad. Okay, when I shift, I'll put on my Renaissance magician hat and have nothing to do with
but we are talking about ancestral plasma intelligences in some way, correct?
Yeah. Sure, and the idea that we're all in part descendants of people from the stars or the clouds, or however you would want to think about that.
They I think even the Cherokee Dahani called them star elders, and the bird people, and the Iroquois had a word for that, and the
well, I'll give you a reason, an example, just about why I'm a bit reticent in talking about this. Chester Mahudi, you might have seen, as a Zuni elder who is splashed around on YouTube talking about UFOs. And he really doesn't say that much. Well, one of his ancestors, who Alex Ciautua, the person my book is about, called Old Mahuti, was one of the sources for there being Kachinas in the old Spanish mission several hundred years back. So, however, one suspects that the knowledge or belief that tribal that some tribal people are descended from the stars is part of those teachings. I'm not authorized to talk about those teachings. And Chester Mahudi was kicked off the Pueblo for these interviews he did that showed up on YouTube. And I don't want to get disinvited to the Pueblo. I like being there a great deal.
I see. But now you dropped a few more little nuggets there. We're going to have a lot of questions for Dr. Terry tonight, guys. You dropped another little nugget there, Teresa, about you and Alan are talking to these 3 tall blue people. Could you?
He's done that since he was in his 20s, and that's like a third conversation, Dan. I mean,
we like having a lot of them going at once.
Yeah. No, that's what he's yes, he's done that since he was in his 20s, and we'll actually get to that near the end of the presentation, because one of the things that I want to ask is, how do we know that Enochian is a Judeo-Christian concept? I mean, if it is, it's fine. I don't have any real problem with that. But how do you know that Dee and Kelly weren't talking to extraterrestrial beings? And you wanted to talk a little bit about astral hygiene. Well, how do you know if you're talking to someone you want to talk to, if you're able to talk to someone?
Well, but since Alan has known these tall blue beings for this long, he must have a pretty clear sense of who, what,
They said at a certain point, when I said, are you the beings that talk to Dee and Kelly? Their response was, no, we are the intermediaries for those beings, basically those beings like the eye in the tornado that you saw in
yes.
Sedona. If it's only in a rare situation where your consciousness could stand interacting with something that large and powerful. So that's what they told him. Your how do they say, your mileage may vary? I'm not
but
I'm just a mild-mannered Latin translator. I mean,
you're mild-mannered. I like asking Teresa questions, But so the Ophanim logo, reminder everyone, Ophanim logo is an eye in a tornado. I mean, you gotta love that. What does that tell you? It's just like so he's been talking to the tall blue. Okay, so now Teresa also then promised us, speaking of dropping little nuggets, she's going to give us a 2-minute thumbnail on what John Dee's meant.
What the hieroglyphic monad meant?
Yeah.
Well, he
explained the whole thing in 3 minutes. No.
That's several slides in my presentation, but to get to it's the philosopher's stone. If you understand the hieroglyphic monad, you understand the philosopher's stone, and you understand why it's associated with the number 252 and so on. And if you're a ceremonial magician, particularly if you're into Golden Dawn style magic, which just means like a Kabbalistically based initiatory system, the Golden Dawn being the first, and the ones that use Enochian. So that would be the Golden Dawn, the Stella Matutina, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, all the Golden Dawn spinoffs, the AA and all the Crowley spinoffs, the Society for the Inner Light, the Aurum Solus, any of these Kabbalistically based initiatory systems. The correspondences they tend to use, for example, in the Golden Dawn knowledge lectures, all can be found in the hieroglyphic monad except for Hebrew, which of course raises the question of why not Hebrew? But then if you realize one of the things that all of these systems really, except for like Boda, which Paul Foster Case removed the Enochian from the system in Boda, and Dion Fortune didn't use it in the Society for Inner Light, but all the others, the ones that use Enochian, use Hebrew. Well, there are many reasons we could talk about why that would be. And Dan, you're the expert on that, of languages, alphabets as waveguides and so on. But also by the time you get the Seal of Emet with John Dee, that is based in Hebrew. So I know the way that Vincent looked at it was to look at Hebrew as sort of an interface, a 3-dimensional interface, and you can map the Hebrew alphabet to a cube. So that as a sort of 3D interface that Enochian kind of rests upon, being
on the HYPERCUBE, which is your subject tonight. But just just permit me one indulgence, if you would. See, so there I was, a fairly skeptical electrical engineer studying, hieroglyphic monad, barely studying. And I love it, say that it represents alchemy, philosopher's stone, charge, collapse, implosion, perfect, wonderful, beautiful. But then I'm reading and it says, well, basically the only thing he's saying is every single astrological symbol overlaid one on top of the other, and you got hieroglyphic monad. And where's the physics there? I just
Well, see, Dan, I mean, with all respect, I love you, Dan, but you're making the same mistake that like C.H. Austin and great scholars have made. I mean, you have to. I first started writing about this in 2007. And the other thing is, if you look at the monad and Enochian together and you don't believe in any of this stuff or use any of this stuff, it looks like spycraft because you can do clock ciphers with the face of the hieroglyphic monad, and the Enochian grids look like Cardan grills. And so but you find out most of this through punning. And this was Vincent Bridges, one of his many contributions was to say, well, DEE sort of stumbled onto the idea of the hypercube. There was no word for the hypercube. So people, and then DEE is in a kind of frenzied apocalyptic moment talking about the seniors in the book of Revelation, rotating him around him and telling King Maximilian that, you'll be there, but I won't. And so he's got this cube with a sphere in it, which is actually a circle, but with DEE you tend to flip things between dimensions. So he's got this circle of the 24 elders rotating around. So you make them into a sphere and you put them in a cube, and he sees that cube as connecting to his cube in the time that he is. So you have a cube, and it's the ether between them is what substitutes for the concept of higher dimensions. Now, this idea generally has been talked about. Last week, you were talking about Yurka Riksavi and Gaia and so on. Yurka, so one of their current shows is Sacred Geometry with Robert Gilbert, not the Rosicrucian Robert Gilbert, but an ex-military Robert Gilbert, which is sort of interesting.
Oh, from Asheville. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. But he makes the point, and he's not the first one to make this point, that when you have the Royal Academy of Science in Britain, for example, strip out spirituality from science, which they have a reason for doing. It's the end of a very bloody period in European history. But when they do that, mathematics is no longer a sacred pursuit. But mathematics sort of reinvents all of that back in by adding in higher dimensions. You have exactly the same thing. So what DEE would connect, this cube to this one with the ether, we'd talk about a hypercube rotating through its center. When you get some of the quotes that I have on a later slide about, the universe being a sphere. Well, these quotes make no sense until you make it a hypersphere, and then suddenly they make mathematical
and the
sense.
Superposed rotations and the implosion kind of fits. So it's just the actual symbols used that I was probably too lazy to understand. But so, well, before
you probably had bigger thoughts on your mind, Dan. I'm just
but folks, everyone here, so this is Teresa Burns. Teresa Burns is an amazing scholar. She's a serious historian. She's a professor of, is it English literature or?
It's English and technical writing, actually.
Yes, and she spent a lifetime. She was Vincent Bridges' co-author. She's probably the most knowledgeable person in the world, in my view, about Ophanim, Enochian and John Dee and Kelly, and certainly the history lessons thereunto. And so I just have endless fun listening to Teresa, guys, and I'm so happy that she's here. So and Teresa has prepared a nice presentation for us, and we don't want to get in the way of that, because I think it's going to be. And then when you have your images there, then you can finish these thoughts better, probably.
Okay, well, we'll see.
Yeah. So just briefly before we do that, were there any announcements to found there, or are we good? Or
hi Dan, hi Terry. So next week we are going to meet with Dan Winter about implosion in water, hypersolubility for agriculture and health as the core fractal wave mechanics of implosion, negentropy, and life force and consciousness. And the following week we'll be meeting with Patrick Bode about HRV.
Heart rate.
And these are our upcoming lectures.
So those are the upcoming. Thank you, Tufan. And Tufan, we're reminding folks, Tufan Guven is the hero who came in here for almost 3 weeks and helped me. And as of today, Tufan, I think I almost got it done. I sent you. So my new book, plonkfire.com, is virtually completed, guys. And it's pretty cool. I think it's going to be powerful and useful. So that's exciting news. And you'll see it there. And the release is due imminently. And we'd even ask Teresa for feedback, but we'll get that later because she's so busy. But also one other just little note, the rather big interview I did with Elena Denon is releasing about 1 hour from now. That's fun. But anyway, those are just minor sidetrack announcements. So Teresa Burns is presenting tonight. And what we announced tonight's subject as, Teresa, was HYPERCUBE and Terry?
Oh, you had it as hypercubes and the hyperspheres in the 16th century, but you also wanted me to talk a little bit about astral hygiene and talking to ancestors.
Right. And just a little context here. We felt that the idea of how rotations get superposed and ultimately implode was beautifully implied by what Vincent, for example, worked out in the Symmetry of the Ophanim Enochian, relating to the idea of the hypercube. And Teresa, in addition to her knowledge of the history of these things, is really gone deeply into that. And remember, Teresa and Alan have incredible personal background in how these are used powerfully in ritual. So all of that being said, now we're turning this over to Teresa. Terry Burns, go ahead.
Okay, well, thanks. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully it'll go well here. What I'm going to do is, let's see, did that work? Hopefully it did.
Yes, you're up.
So I'm going to talk about the hieroglyphic monad of John Dee, hypercubes and hyperspheres in the 16th century. And I want to, as the subtitle says here, talk about how the sacred geometry of his monad sets the foundation for John Dee and Edward Kelly's Ophanic Enochian. Now, the reason I was mentioning all that stuff before about Kabbalistically based initiatory societies is because they will tend to have you go through a bunch of knowledge lectures. Vincent Bridges, with his Fifth Way Mystery School, put together his own knowledge lectures. But as I mentioned, all of those correspondences are implicit in the monad, except for Hebrew, and we'll talk about why Hebrew is not there because it becomes very important. These are the two guys I'm going to talk about. You've seen them before if you've been around Dan very much, and I recognize a lot of you. Here is John Dee, and here is Edward Kelly, his sidekick, nemesis, or what have you.
Very crotchety, later to be, we think, Vincent Bridges. And Vincent thought I had some connection to Dee, so it was colorful.
I can imagine. So in fact, I don't have to imagine, I've witnessed it. So some background on the hieroglyphic monad, if you haven't heard of it, it was written in it was written in 1564. It was dedicated to the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. His son, by the way, was Rudolph, who Dee and Kelly dealt with in Prague. Dee talks about it as a magical parable. He said he explained it to Queen Elizabeth, but what does it actually mean? Now, the most famous scholar to study it in the generation before this one was C.H. Yostin, who was a brilliant, brilliant man. But he said that first, it's a work of alchemy, but basically he doesn't know what it means. But initiates were supposed to get some kind of verbal teaching, and he doesn't know what it means. I think Yostin is mistaken. You can understand the monad very well. It just takes a long time. That's why I'm going to have 10 one-hour classes just talking about the theorems, not even the letter to Maximilian. And probably no one will watch those because it's pretty arcane, but at least it'll be out there. Anyway, we can understand it pretty well. It was written in 13 days. And I don't know why that came up last. But anyway, you can see right here, this same glyph was in Dee's famous work on navigation, the Propoitomata Aphoristica, which is basically, that translates into something like the foundational stuff you need before you learn anything else. It uses the same kind of correspondences. This glyph also appears in The Chemical Wedding, which is a famous Rosicrucian text. In fact, Francis Yates said that the secret philosophy behind all the Rosicrucian manifestos was the philosophy of John Dee has summed up in the Monads. Well, if that's the case, it'd be really nice to know what it means, right?
Well, I may also mention that it reminds me of your professor, like Vincent was a professor of Shakespeare, saying that Shakespeare is all about alchemy. And it took most of my life to have the first clue what that might even mean. But in fact, the fusion experience you have at the end of the play where everyone feels oneness with all, that there's actually some deep meaning there. So I'm loving this idea of getting alchemy out of this. Please do.
So the correspondences I mean are things like correspondences with Platonic solids, correspondences. Now this is a work of geometry also, but there were problems with interpreting it. Here are some 2 pages from the original Monad. One of the problems, which is actually is kind of a cool thing, I think, is that Dee treats letters like shapes. And so whether a letter is large or small, how many letters are on a page, all these things become significant, but they tended to be overlooked by translators. I have some snarky comments on the bottom of this slide, which I won't read, but I will direct you. This is from the letter to Maximilian. And it's about the ideal ruler being a kind of philosopher king. And this Y is a Pythagorean Y. So you have Pythagorean correspondences all the way through as well, along with references to the planets, to alchemical symbols, to numbers. And so if you look at some of the illustrations, and these are ones that my husband, Alan, and you see I'm on here as J. Alan Moore. That's Alan, my husband. I don't know. I thought I was logging on as myself, but I wasn't. Anyway, so here's the monad glyph in this upper corner. Dee will go through and first he'll say, oh, well, this is the moon, right? Can you see my arrow there?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay, yes. So this is Diana's bow, and here is the sun. And he'll say, well, sometimes the moon seems bigger than the sun, and so on. And you're like, what are you talking about, John Dee? And here are the elements, and here's the fire. Well, we use alchemical fire to heat up the elements, and then what? Well, you know, it was the emerald tablet, the marriage of the sun and the moon. In fact, Dan has written a modern emerald tablet. So you have the fusion of the sun and the moon. Now, I could go on like this, and I will in my class for about 10 hours, and hopefully it won't be so confusing. But so what he will do at first is take apart all of these, and it seems like he is explaining astronomy. And then, well, maybe he is talking about geometric shapes. But if you understand that each of these are going to transform, well, here you have a circle. Visualize how that would turn into a sphere, and we'll get to a hypersphere. This cross is going to be that you perhaps can see how that would turn into a square, but if you, and then a cube, but if you can't, the way it would be doing it is picture a cube with like 2 cubes on top, 2 cubes on the bottom, like that. And that's what this will turn into through his different transformations. What you have here are just the first 2 theorems. So I want to digress about these for a minute, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I'm only going to go through these 2. And so he'll say, by means of the straight line and the circle, the first and simplest production and representation of things was made in the light. When he says this, he'll use the fiat lux of Genesis, which is written in Latin as LVX, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Hidden behind the veil of nature is a real sexual pun in the Renaissance. Nature begets nature, and he will, by the end of this, have different letters having sex with other letters and grammatical and case endings, and it's a lot of fun, but one might think, well, what's the point? Okay, now, if you look at this, okay, take a circle. A circle is a kind of image of perfection. Now, I know Dan talks a lot about the difference between, you know, an ovoid form and how that supports life and a sphere doesn't. But if we just want to talk about a perfect form, think of a circle. It's really hard for anyone to freehand draw a circle. But the minute you have a compass, you put a point down and it's easy to draw a circle. So a lot could be said about the compass and straight edge and how important they are, not only in Western culture, but as in Chinese, for example, you see the brother and sister that gave birth supposedly to the Chinese people holding a compass and straight edge. There's a file that I've got on that is on my group, that if you want more information on that, I can talk about it. But so when Dee jumps in and starts talking about lines and circles and points, he's jumping into the world of Greek geometry. And here, in this next one, I don't know what you see, but what I see is how, using his instructions in the 23rd theorem with the compass and straight edge, you would draw the monad. And he's also going to claim in his letter to Maximilian that he succeeds in squaring the circle. Modern mathematicians would disagree with him. He will claim he doubled the cube. There's a third one, the trisection of an angle, that he doesn't claim that he does in here, but he claims that he does those first two. Now, that's kind of amazing. And if we had more time, I'd take you through how he says he does that. But those of you that are magicians know how important visualization is. You're visualizing standing waves when you cast a circle or a sphere or anything like that. Well, if you read any ancient Greek geometric text, and Dee was an expert in this and was an underreader in Greek at Cambridge under Henry VIII, you have this strange form called, I think, the perfect subjunctive. But anyway, it's like you're doing a geometric proof and you find out that this perpendicular will have been dropped. And it's called the helping hand. The idea is that as you are visualizing these geometric proofs, you're doing them also. You're visualizing them as Platonic perfect forms. Vincent Bridges used to joke that around John Dee's house in Mortlake was probably a clutter of astral forms from Dee doing all this geometry. I would suggest that as they moved through Europe, where Dee is teaching the monad to different people, including, according to Dee, to Rudolph II, you're getting more of these astral forms.
You got me so excited here when you said there's a solution to alchemy in here somewhere. Of course, Maximilian's son Rudolph, what Dee and Kelly depended on him was for support for their alchemy experiments. So I'd love to see this actually do the alchemy solution as well, of course.
Well, I think the alchemy solution that it's going to do is fuse what's called spherical geometry with Cartesian geometry. Because part of the squaring of that's one of the problems of the squaring of the circle as a proof is you've got pi. Pi is an irrational number, so it's never going to work out perfectly. You've got to take an approximation for pi. Because it's the same problem as reconciling a map, a Mercator projection with something that's roughly globe shaped.
Yeah, so, and it's also the globe theater and how the geometry of the theater alone was enough to help make consumed perspective possible, which is why Shakespeare was about alchemy, because it was a fusion of perspectives.
Right. So, and I mean, no one would presume to, Vincent presumed to think, but most people don't presume to think that the hieroglyphic monad and Enochian allowed Kelly to do physical transmutation. But I would say if you consider a type of alchemy, quantum entanglement and all of the things you can do if you can superimpose this space that I am in and I am creating over any other space.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty intense alchemy. Okay.
And we are saying that entanglement perfected is the problem phase conjugation solves. and thus fusion. So
So, I mean, that's pretty alchemical.
yeah,
I mean, it's
exactly.
now, so the problem of classical geometry and Robert or Wilson, is now Callie Wilson, looked at the 20th theorem in the monad and talked about how what D does with the doubling of the cube was, in effect, he's creating a hypercube, except he's not. He is in a sleight of hand saying, well, Rudolph will have this hypercube because Rudolph will be one of the 24 elders rotating around Christ in the book of Revelation, but he, D, will just be sleeping in a better place. Okay, well, let's imagine that you're Rudolph and not D. Then what you have in that theorem is you have a cube around, and you have a sphere inscribed in a cube around D. You have a sphere inscribed in a cube in the book of Revelation. You have them connected. Well, that's pretty close to a hypercube. That's one way that you give a three-dimensional drawing of a hypercube. And so this is what I was saying before we started. The way that D conceives Christian transcendence is what we might call a Cartesian fourth dimension. There's another quote that you run into a lot in Hermeticism. God is an infinite sphere, the center of which is everywhere, the circumference nowhere. Nicholas of Cusa said this. It's been attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It's been attributed to Marsilio Ficino. I mean, it's been attributed to Aleister Crowley. All of them said this. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it becomes a mathematically true statement if you get rid of this notion of sphere and call it a hypersphere. The center of a hypersphere can be anywhere. Its circumference would be nowhere. So now what is important?
Not John, but I think these people, if they had some inclination that the implosive compression point makes a connection between nodes in a longitudinal array for action at a distance, that kind of connection to the connection to the central node of a rotating array would have been a language that would have enabled them to get past this abstraction. Perhaps just a thought. They really,
I mean, you've hit the problem is D does not have a language for what he's, and so you're left with, if you're working in this century when we do have a language for, like, well, could he be talking about this? Now, my interest in it, frankly, is less, wouldn't it have been nice if D had a language like hypersphere? Then, oh, if this works, this sets up the foundations for the Ophanim, and the problems that you've raised about astral hygiene are fairly easily solved. Okay.
and we shouldn't pick on John Dee because Einstein only called action at a distance spooky, so he wasn't that close either.
Well, we're getting better and better, see? So now I'm going to get to what I think was your favorite theorem, Dan. But first, I want to just point out one way that there's a typo here. What is one way to project a torus? That word right there should be hypercube. I think I was typing fast and loose here. One way that you can project a hypercube into 3D is a torus. And the way that you would describe that geometrically is a hyperbola. So let's go back to the monad. The word monad just means unit. It's a basic unit in Pythagorean, Platonic, and Euclidean thought. It suggests it's Tractus, Kabbalah, Genesis. And I mentioned Hebrew. One of the ways that, even though very little Hebrew appears in the monad, that we know that D is working with things Kabbalistically is, one, he collected Hebrew grammars. He had a huge compendium of Hebrew tables, which unfortunately is lost. And also you can read, if you know how to do it, the first 10 theorems in terms of the Sephiroth. So what does not exist but existence vanishes without it, that becomes like the Aum Sof Ur of the Kabbalah.
The
And
Ein
I-
Sof Ur. Ein Sof
Yeah,
Ur.
I think I just yeah.
Right.
So I'm skipping all over the monad, but I wanted to get to this part because this is what will connect us to a hypersphere and hypercube. This one and the 20th theorem, which I had talked about before, is when he's talking about the light of the cross. He's talking about the light, LVX, and the cross, the shape that we all know. And he puns upon crux, like the crux of the matter. He's going to talk about the central point of all of this. And he makes a bunch of sexual puns on nature. He wants you to then visualize the cross in terms of conic sections.
It's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Now, some of you may know that famous painting of Dali where he shows Jesus on the cross and the cross is a hypercube. It's
yes.
So that may be, or speaking for myself, this is what I thought, oh, is he doing this? Is he? No. He's wanting you to visualize the cross in terms of conic sections. And
I mean, if you wanted to know how lasers phase conjugate, that's exactly what you'd have to do. It'd be a perfect cross and look at the conic sections. It's perfect.
So if you take what he's saying in 3 dimensions, suddenly you have a plane that is intersecting 2 cones, and these cones are the cross, right? So the plane can intersect it in one of 7 ways. It can be a circle, an ellipse, a parabola, a hyperbola, a point, a line, and a cross. Now, I'm the only person, it seemed, who read it and realized that. And I had help of bothering, since I was then a university professor, of bothering my mathematician friends at happy hour. I'm like, well, what do you get? And my friend James was like, oh, well, that's a circle, ellipse, parabola, hyperbola, point. I was like, oh, really?
But it's also about how 2 pine cones kiss noses. And if you need to know your angle with respect to the pine cones, that would be your syntax.
Well, what you said. and so, well, and with a hyperbola, you get a mathematical description also of a hypersphere. Now, there's a lot of discussion among those who don't understand the monad about whether DEE even knew what a parabola or hyperbola was, but the person who gives a numeric description of that was in fact Thomas Diggs, who was a student of Dee's. So I have no doubt that Dee did know that. And so Dee is going to use this image, LVX, as a way to express how a point of light as the vertex of a cone exerts influence. And I think that's getting back to what you were saying.
Well, that he used the scintillation point where light cones went through a center, and he used that scintillation point to literally make phone calls to ancestors. So that obviously was an influence of the point of light.
And he was doing it to make cameras too, in a more mundane sense, as you've had an earlier person here talk about. So if you hold that thought for a moment, I'm going to add in more context, maybe too much, but we're going to jump ahead to Enochian. So Dee meets Edward Kelly sometime during 1581 to 1583. We should have had, he writes the monad in 1564. Okay, so during this time period, England, which is where John Dee lives, is in a crisis of succession because Queen Elizabeth doesn't have any kids. It worsens, and by 1588, it's going to lead to the Spanish Armada sailing to England. During that time, Dee and Kelly are going to be in Prague. So the Enochian material as an alphabet or waveguides and grids similar to those used by in Cardan grills by Cardano and other cryptographers comes through at that time. It starts in England, then Poland, then Bohemia during this time period. And also the reason I give this range of dates here is because Edward Kelly first shows up as Edward Talbot, and most people assume they're the same person, but just in case there's anyone who wants to be picky about historical details. Dee returns to England in 1589, Kelly remains in Bohemia. So what happens when one of the smartest men in the world meets one of the most clairvoyant? Crazy things start happening. And that's the Ophanic material. Now, what I am going to do is show you some of that material and then hook it back to the monad. And then that's all I'm really going to have time to talk about. So while still in England, the seal of truth of God comes through, and there will be in here Hebrew, like, all right, Arabiel, Adikiel. All right. Dee is very interested in Hebrew as a sacred language and other sacred languages, and he wants to recover the language that the angels spoke
Right.
to humans. So this seal is the last real tie with what we would call grimoire magic. And Dan, we could talk about it later if you want, but I think the grimoire magic is where you run into the real astral hygiene problems. And I think this seal is often called the best summation or presentation of medieval planetary magic. But you can see how, if you look at that, how it's like you're looking down into a hole, or it might collapse up. If you try to flip this into multiple dimensions, it takes on what interesting forms. There's some blinds written into it also, and I'll drop some links in there because that's something Alan and I have written about, and other people like Clay Holden have. But this is sort of the end of grimoire magic. Now, grimoire magic, the reason I would say there's astral hygiene problems is that few people are connecting it to perfect geometric forms, which is what Dee is a genius at.
And on a very basic level, the 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside, which is the Anu. We believe now that the 7 spins was the 7 spins of tetracube. Inside a dodecaecosa, outside 5 spins and 7 spins, which is perfect implosion, which is the perfect way to sort anything. And the sigil was a way to sort. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the way you're explaining it is, is assuming that there are these integrated waveforms.
Yeah.
But if you are just, putting a squiggle there and saying this is the sigil for so-and-so, I mean, it doesn't show anyone a whole lot of anything other than create a mess unless you're able to transform it into some kind of standing wave. Yep. And if you transform it into standing waves that are 4-dimensional, all kinds of amazing things can happen. Okay, these letters come through. I'll drop a link in there, but one of Vincent Bridges' greatest works was in looking at how you can treat these in triplet form the same way as people use the I Ching and connect that to transfer RNA codons. That's one of the reasons that he argued that Enochian was a gift to humans so that we'd evolve out of our killer monkey phase. Different pieces of the system come through by the time they're in Poland. Now these letters are being arranged in a holy table. Okay, it should be fairly, these graphics, by the way, were done by Alan, my husband. So you can look at this hexagon and make that into a 3-dimensional shape, right? It's a Merkaba. You can, in ways, consider every single one of these working not as a cube, but as a hypercube. Vincent considered this structure like the big scaffolding that holds what comes in next. So you would have that seal of Emmet as a kind of filter to keep out nasty things you didn't want in your sacred space. Then you would have this, the holy table. And here is, in English, the great table of earth. Now, remember this shape here I was talking about in the monad, about how that would turn into two cubes on top of 2 cubes, or what happens if you turn it into a hypercube? You could put this cube in one direction, you could explode it out in 4 directions. Well, and since I have this here, let's just go ahead and have the Enochian characters there. Usually this black cross in the middle gets turned into a tablet of union that you put in the center of your temple. But if you consider that this is what is linking what is farthest away to the center, it's the direction that people have trouble visualizing in a hypercube. So you have this one. This is a flat shape, right? Now, if we explode it into 3D, how do we do this? Well, we could take this one here and put it into the east and put one in each direction. Wait, we don't have a top and bottom. We don't need a top and bottom. They're implied if we have the whole thing rotating through its center like a hypercube, which is very similar to what D has in the monad. So my theory is that because D had this intuitive concept of 4 dimensions, which allowed him to, via Kelly, set up this space where Kelly could then scry and communicate to something far away, you had this material come through. Now, can I prove that? No, but I don't really care. Here, this is with some pretty colors. Those colors are were added by the original Order of the Golden Dawn. Then they had lots of other color scales. But one of the things that people argue about who are magicians with Enochian is, well, why don't we just leave this flat? And it's like, well, because it's stupid. That's one reason not to not leave it flat. Well, how do we know that the Golden Dawn puts, why are they putting one of these in each of the 4 directions? Why does that make sense? Well, because someone in the late 1800s understood the hieroglyphic monad. And by that time, you also had the concept coming in of 4 dimensions. You had books soon after like Flatland, and you get Aleister Crowley, who also claimed to be a reincarnation of Edward Kelly, writing about in Moonchild about 4 dimensions as a magical technique. So someone knew something, we just don't know who or what they knew. Now, I could say a lot more about all of this, but I think I may have overspoke my welcome. So let me stop screen sharing and see if there are questions.
Harry, could you just entertain a 1-minute metaphor here? When I'm obviously always trying to think in electrical terms here. In electrical engineering, they know for sure you got to make the lasers come in a perfect cube, or you don't get any magic, no conjugation. So fine, that's the cube. But now the metaphor of how you rotate that into the next dimension, in physics, they can't explain what the media required for phase conjugation does, which is super dielectric barium strontium titanate, which is a medium at the center where the lasers meet, which allow the pine cones to actually implode and kiss noses right at that center. Exactly Nostradamus's problem until he got the right coat. When Nostradamus got the right coating on the bottom of his scrying cup, then he could phase conjugate and he could see the future. So not only do you need the cones to meet in a cube, but the rotations have to implode at that point, and that requires the pent symmetry to be present with the cubic symmetry, actually. So that I think that the physics problem is actually answered indirectly.
Well, I'm not going to argue with you about that. I think that was brilliant. I'm going to listen to this and write it all down.
But it's just,
no, I think if you remember when we were talking about the casting pentagrams and the pentagram being a shadow of a pentatope.
Yes.
And so, within these large shapes you're setting up are an incredible number of other standing waves, and they just all have to be in resonance with one another. But then you're opening a veil, literally opening a veil to other dimensions and other places where you can talk to things.
Yeah.
And the 5th and final platonic solid, by the way, is the 12-sided dodecahedron. So if you do a pentagon and a pentagon, a pentagram and a pentagon, and you do a supreme invoking ritual, the pentagram, you have, what you're doing is you're casting a dodecahedron, and now that dodecahedron is there with this torus going through it. The 5th element, this 12-sided dodecahedron, was sacred and sometimes secret in ancient Greece. Plato hints about it when he talks about the earth as looking from above like a 12-sided ball.
Yes, and the dodeca is the grid, and that it fits all those things. But people could accuse me of the only tool I have is a hammer, so everything looks like a nail. The only tool I have is longitudinal interferometry, created by phase conjugation, which answers all the questions about the connectivity of where the hypercube is going. The hypercube starts going because the cube is embedded in the pentadodeca, which is the phase conjugation that compresses into the nodal array of the longitudinal interferometry. And that's where the superposed rotations enable, for example, action at a distance. So if John Dee had had some electrical language to talk about, I think his evolution would have been much accelerated. That's my point.
Well, can I ask you, when you have talked often about how ovoid structures tend to support life and spheres don't, but would you say a sphere and a hypersphere, how would you relate? I know that the way you have it set up in the monad is you are inscribing a sphere in a cube, and then you can have another one inscribed on the outside. So that's also another projection of a hypersphere. So it seems like that the way that you set up temple space, you're using this as astral hygiene, as a barrier, so stuff doesn't get in and mess up what you're doing. I mean, you're not now within that you can have an ovoid structure, or more likely a spiral in an ovoid structure, and stuff grows in our temples.
The physics kind of works here in the sense that if you put a cube in a dodeca, visualized Tufan Star Mother kit, you make a kind of fusion implosion. For example, why noble gases and platinum group metals phase conjugate, because all of the electron shells are full, meaning the cube in the dodeca is all working, meaning fusion is working, meaning sorting is possible. And that's exactly what you're referring to, I think, Teresa, is that if you get, if you pick the sigil of truth, which is basically a 7-spin inside a 5-spin, which is cube inside dodeca, then that fusion, what fusion does is the implosive force means that any wave that's out of phase does not make it through center, the physics of the witch's pentacle.
Yeah.
So that all that physics works perfectly here. And with regard to your question about the sphere versus the egg, it's very simple, really, why Mother Nature will never use a sphere for anything just about except an eyeball. And you measure how close a cell is to cancer. If it got spherical, that's the definition of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because it's harmonic exclusive instead of harmonic inclusive. So an egg can be plasma projective, it can be harmonic inclusive, and it's definitely directional. Whereas a sphere, there's one harmonic only, and that is death to any immune system, for example. So in that sense, a sphere is the opposite of immune health in cellular metabolism. And that's why Bucky Fuller, I talked last week about. So in that sense, the egg does work. But for the language that Dee is developing here, completing the implosion into a sphere to enable the hypercube, to enable what I call longitudinal interferometry, I think works perfectly. I think you could start with what John Dee wrote about the penta and the hex, and finish the thought if you understood the wave mechanics of longitudinal arrays. Collective unconscious is beautiful. And now we know the kids who, can see without their eyes, suddenly they're seeing their ancestors, exactly what John Dee wanted to do.
So, well, I'm glad that worked. By the way, I am putting up here, this is maybe talking about in more detail what I was talking about how squaring of the circle, if you're looking at it, is trying to fuse spherical geometry and Cartesian geometry. But then, of course, Bucky Fuller is not using Cartesian geometry, he's using Fuller geometry. So just a word to the wise, like most of the things that Fuller talks about as being multiple dimensions are actually third dimensions phase shifted. And one of the things people who talk about dimensionality rarely get to is to talk about, well, what if something is 3D, but it's just phase shifted and it's not your 3D? I mean, you can look at a ghost that way, for that matter. So, but to try to keep things simple, I'm just dealing with it as Cartesian geometry, but Fuller is doing a whole different thing. And as you know, gosh, the fellow at the Newport lighthouse.
Alan Green? No.
No, that was a Shakespeare guy. I
Oh,
can't
no.
think of his name.
Oh,
But
yeah. The Newport Tower. Yeah.
Yeah, he was very into Bucky Fuller's geometry also.
Yeah.
And he analyzed the hieroglyphic monad in terms of geometry and said, well, this makes perfect sense if you use Fuller's geometry. So,
well, Fuller was talking about what we call the tensor equilibrium, which basically is where the vector flexure, which Tufan is now making, arose, the jitterbug, and that is charge collapse. And the real meaning was charge collapse, implosion, actually. But even Buckminster Fullerene, now named after Bucky himself would not have understood why it's magic, because it's a conjugator, actually, and it is implosive. So all of which is beyond Bucky's own concept of that. His concept was simply efficiency of tensors for structural stability and efficiency of use of materials. In terms of what electric field in architecture makes a seed grow, he didn't have a clue, unfortunately. And the Fuller Institute today still doesn't. And they still think these damn metal sphere geodesics are useful. In fact, they're poison to every living seed.
yeah.
I think that was Jim Egan.
Oh, yes. That's it. Jim Egan.
Jim Egan. Yes. Yeah. Jim Egan. Thanks.
Thank you. Tufan is a real resource there. Well,
right before COVID hit, we were planning on going there, and he had said we could go into the lighthouse, the Newport Tower lighthouse, which he thinks John DEE designed, and he has good reasons for thinking that. And he said we could come in and do Enochian magic, but now I don't know. Then COVID hit and no one could go anywhere, or at least you weren't supposed to let people into lighthouses to do Enochian magic.
Teresa, it just occurs to me that I would really like to ask you a messy question.
Sure.
Everyone, I consider Teresa a world expert on DEE and Kelly's personal history. And there's the famous story of Vincent Bridges' death, when apparently two different of Kelly's ghosts, there was one of Kelly's ghosts at most and one of Kelly's ghosts in Kelly's tower. And there was serious karma. How could somebody have multiple ghosts that get in trouble with each other?
Well, let's just make that question even messier and say, like, in my life, I have met 3 different people who seem to have the memory of Edward Kelly. Now with Vincent, it was like by far over the top, like,
detailed.
If you never, it sounds crazy talking about it, but if you were around Vincent, you were just like, oh, okay.
Yeah, he remembers.
But so I think there is a lot more to human consciousness than most people think of. I mean, right? They think of, well, you die and then maybe you haunt and there's one ghost and then you're reincarnated as one person. And I think, I really think that the Nyingma Buddhists have a lot better conception of consciousness as it relates to physical form and beyond physical form. And within that kind of tradition, it'd be like, well, of course you can have multiple.
Yeah, like Oversoul 7, Jane Roberts Seth, very similar. The threads of the intent of the soul in various personalities. And when you multiply that by the fact that Kelly and Vincent apparently remembered being Crowley, I mean, and then remembered being Flamel as well. I mean, the plot thickens.
But it gets unbelievable if you think, well, of course, this one person remembers that. But if you think those memories might be accessible to multiple people, it happened that he had really strong, what would you call it, wave coherence. I mean, he could just tune in. But think of how remote viewing works. Okay, if I'm looking around this room is made of these structures are all standing waves. This is what I see. Well, you could, if you were very good at remote viewing and you knew this was where you wanted to come, you could drop in and see.
And Vincent reported that remote viewing John Dee's tower. I mean, he was He was
Mhm.
incredibly good. But then this does allow us, if we wanted to learn something deep here, to have some grokking then of the soul purpose of the complex soul behind Vincent Kelly and Flamel and Crowley, all being one consciousness. I mean, that's pretty intense.
Well, and then also as someone evolves, they sort of shed, glimpses of who the, I mean, at least by some teachings, I realize that's not a Western teaching. But so when you're dealing with one way to conceptualize that, to go back to your original question, is the idea of ghosts. I mean, here's Kelly shed this ghost, and here's Kelly later shed another ghost.
Yeah.
So now here's the ghost that was hanging around who is now guilty because he's afraid he caused the death of Vincent. I mean, it's weird sound, very weird sounding, but it all is.
Yeah. And it's amazing how the threads of Vincent / Kelly / Flamel / Crowley, many of those threads rotate around the deep science of alchemy. Even when Vincent is writing about how Shakespeare learned what alchemy was from Kelly and DEE. I mean, that is heavy.
Well, and for those of you listening who don't, Vincent had this story that he told often about in the First Crusade, a rabbi, although there's some problems with that, this would have probably been an Arabic person who knew the Kabbalah well, or what, anyway, putting a curse on him so that he would not forget. And I thought, well, in terms of just the coherence of consciousness, how does that work? Well, you freeze that set of waveforms. So now you're going to remember this until you can kind of work yourself out of this Rubik's cube you've been stuck into, to make a horrible metaphor.
Well, and the SSP story, the secret space program, the way they abduct people is they use trauma to fractionate the personality, literally making separate ghosts, which arise from trauma. Because if you can't remember coherently through the pain, then your personality, literally your soul, can get fractionated. And there's the reassembling of that soul memory here around the deep physics of alchemy, in the sense of the fusion of people, which is really what Shakespeare was after, a fusion experience, which now is our luciddreamteam.com. How do people fuse that they can lucid dream as one? So maybe we should do a apologia for the life of Vincent in terms of where the karma was going.
Well, Vincent was appearing around here the other night, and I sort of think at least some part of him is reincarnated. It was like there was Vincent and there was this little dude that was like, hurry up and get this Enochian work out of there, because I'm tired of dropping in on you people.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
But that's another, I mean, ghost stories is a whole nother fun conversation.
Well, we have believed now that therified plasma is rather helpful for releasing ghosts. And we think we understand some of the physics, that if you don't get enough centripetal force during death, you cannot implode yourself coherently into the longitudinal array called the collective unconscious. And until you get that critical inertial escape velocity, you need somebody else, or somebody else's aura, or some peak experience to get you compressed and imploded and back into the array, actually. So inhabiting that array is really the task.
Now, what I would like to do is to to kind of map these ideas into an understanding of Kabbalah, because if you're doing a path working, and you are doing a path working to Yesod, whether it's on the great tree, a small tree, or whatever, what you often encounter are different belief systems of what happens in the afterlife. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. But you can find different stories. Oh, Astral City is one, and What Dreams Are Made Of, which was an old Robin Williams movie, playing around with the notion of, okay, so then what happens with someone who has no such belief, no such experience, and is profoundly depressed, and so they're not going to have a very coherent aura. They're going to have a real messed up aura. So what happens to that sort of soul? Well, you get
But Tomislav is mentioning in the comment group here, and it may be too fun to do this too, but Tomislav says, Ra Uruhu talks about people who fail to reach the bardo, end up in rogue bundles that basically roam the earth. Are these the same as ghosts? Very appropriate question. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me they are. What do you think?
Yeah. Yeah. And if we had some electrical notion of what fail to reach the bardo means, so it's more than myth. This is actually science. For example, if you happen to die in bliss on the altar at Machu Picchu, probably you're going to reach the bardo. Whereas if you die in trauma in an electrosmog hospital, successful compression is not so easy. And, you know, we now know that death visions are electrically contagious. We know that the sequence of visions you see at death, the cluviform constants, lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, are exactly DNA doing implosion. That's why you need to see your whole life at the moment of death. It's about compression. And that's alchemy. And that was Vincent's issue.
And then there's a place where it occurs. I mean, you know, the place where Vincent was in Mount Gilead was on a major ley line. There was just constant ghost traffic, not bad ghost traffic. It's just they were going somewhere. But you get to places where the ley lines have been cut and you just get a real mess. Now with Kelly's ghosts in Kelly's tower and all the ghosts that were running around in there, that gets to be real interesting because those were all down on the ground, and it's up in the tower that Vincent thinks Kelly was doing his Enochian work, and that was in an area that was focused as kind of a lens, but the energy coming through was just going to the tower. It wasn't going below, and so you had a lot of trapped garbage down there, or one could argue that anyway.
Yeah, and that's probably where Vincent was when he died, actually. And yeah, the symbolism is so, but the metaphor here about what it takes to release a ghost is, you know, if someone is present with bliss and real intention, their aura can be used usefully, but there are astral hygiene issues that you don't get caught up in the karma. But the process of releasing ghosts is a very legitimate shamanic activity, and Aboriginal people, of course, would have techniques for that as well.
Hey, Dan, can I make a quick, I forgot to end with this. So anyone who here is interested in alchemy and Ophanic magic is welcome to join us on our group. And if you're interested in the hieroglyphic monad, it's available from Ouroboros Books. And that is my not so well done PR.
Oh, no. So how would they join your group practically?
Just type in, I'll drop a link in there. I'm sort of having in the chat, but just go and say that you were there's some questions that you need to ask. Just say that you are associated with Dan Winter and you're in.
And are you referring to the Facebook group, Alchemy Ophanim? So Terry is the moderator for the Alchemy Ophanim group in Facebook, and that's one contact point. Yes, and
we have a lot of files there that if what I am talking about is hard to follow, which I'm actually, and I apologize, I'm sure that it is because I'm trying to condense a lot of material down, but we have a huge number of files there. They're all freely downloadable, and we'd love to see you there.
It's a good library, and Terry's been doing serious work with the group there for many years. It's a good thing. Thomas Loft asked, ghosts can be released. Wow. Just using the example, we have implosive plasma from Therify, which is helpful. But if you were to do something like that, or even some kind of ritual with a group that set their intent, even better at a magnetic cross, even better at sunrise, sunset, even better at equinox, solstice, all those things that allow that compression to implode the plasma. And that is how ghosts are released, because successful death, which doesn't require ghosts, because at the time of death, your body is biologically designed to do the implosion, to squirt you into the array. And remember, to get you into that array is very simple. At the compression point, remembered your whole life at the moment of death, there's impedance matching to the longitudinal nodes of that array, which is the dreaming track, song line. The legends all now fit the physics beautifully. So we can say with some accuracy of what the process of releasing a ghost is. Tufan, do you want to select any of the questions there?
Sure, we have one from, let me see. This one is regarding the Tablet of Union. Saraswati asks if these symbols are the same as Orthodox Christian iconography symbols, 15th, 17th century.
Oh, the Tablet of Union is made of Enochian letters, and so no, it's not. It's derived from the Black Cross of the Great Table of Earth, which is all in Enochian letters, sometimes called Ophanic, sometimes called angelic, but those glyphs that I showed early on.
But you can see, but to relate to that question, what was called the Tablet of Nalvaj and others, that you can, if you read vertically up and down, you read Michael, Gabriel, Michael,
oh no, that's early on. That's with that's with the seal of Amet, and that's how he is. So
you can get Christian angel names literally. That's
as long as you're with the seal of Amet, you can, because then you're using Hebrew. But once you get into Enochian, but D and people call the names of the Enochian seniors, for example, angels, because they're using Judeo-Christian terms. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you could call them Martians. I mean, I don't know why but in other words, there's not, once you are into the Enochian script, there's not, in my opinion, really any Christian iconography. Everything leading up to it, there is. Now, a few of them, like Medimi, who is this very sexy little angel that is enticing Kelly, who is apparently easily enticeable. I mean, that's sort of out of grimoire magic, but sort of not. There's a Madimiel, some of these really just occur in Dee's spirit diary. So one thing that I am going to write up eventually in our Enochian group is, how would you do Enochian if you want to do it within a Judeo-Christian context, that's fine. I mean, and that's what most people do. But what if you didn't? Well, one way you could do it is a way that the Aurum Solus does it, and use ancient Greek instead of Hebrew. And it works a lot better than you think. If you're like, well, what about the Kabbalah? There is a theory now that, that there are Kabbalahs other than Hebraic Kabbalah. I happen to like Hebraic Kabbalah, but the Sephiroth, of the way we look at it, basically comes from D. It's called the Kircher tree. Kircher comes after D, and he refers to the monad in his writing. And that is a Christian or Hermetic Kabbalah. There are all kinds of other ways of picturing Kabbalah. There's a big argument about whether the Greeks had Kabbalah. But if you take the top three Sephiroth and go into use other Greek words for those, then the next ones that are attributed to the planet, you just take the ancient Greek words for the planet, and the Aurum Solus as a whole system by which you can set up the whole thing just using ancient Greek, which I'm very used to using.
But there's
angels, but you don't have to do that.
But I think there's a really lovely potential physics behind much of that, in the sense that if the angel names were symmetry operations, which obviously in one sense or other, and symmetry operations are a name for how potentially interstellar plasma becomes intelligent because it becomes implosive. I mean, we look practically at, Elena Denon says the return of the nine. Well, the return of the nine has been talked about in almost every culture around there, from Greek to Egyptian. They all had their Ennead, and including the Anunnaki, they were the nine. Well, that is beautiful plasma physics, actually, if you know how 9 plasma domains self-organize, the physics of the Sri Yantra. So suddenly, this is an introduction to how interstellar plasma becomes intelligent. And that is a beautiful pure principle that can wrap some of these things together with some empowering physics. That's all I would.
No, I think that's
Yeah,
Very
but
good.
what I admire about Teresa is she actually knows the history of these things so much better than I do. But the physics is. So Saraswati and Tufan just mentioned some of her questions, but she's saying her father, most amazing man, had cardiac arrest and he was non-smoker. And after she felt him as she was preparing the burial, she felt his ghost go into her, and they've literally been together ever since. I mean, this is,
That's
awesome. There can be all kinds of astral issues. However, this can be one of the most beautiful examples of, if you have not communicated with your ancestors today, you haven't had a day. That's the Aboriginal notion of these things. And so there can be something very beautiful that your ancestors are literally a team with you, and that coherence can be a beautiful intelligence. So
Right.
it is all about how plasma inhabits bodies. My psychophysiology of schizophrenia professor Albert X, he was all into the chemistry of schizophrenia, but they didn't have a clue it was actually about plasma entities inhabiting bodies. That would have never occurred to them.
Huh.
So anyway, I think understanding the communication with ancestors. So Tufan, do you want to pick any other questions that looked fun?
By the way, I shared on the chat box, I shared the PDF file of Jim Egan's The History of the John Lee Tower.
Oh, good.
And I particularly wanted to ask Terry if she can give us some more details about her upcoming course about the hieroglyphic monad, if I didn't misunderstand.
No, sure. What I wanted to do, well, first, right, so Nancy and I wrote this book. It came out a couple years ago, and what I know from long, painful experience from 2007 to now is you can put it in a book and no one will read it. And it's like Dan, have your books. I love your books, but I'd much rather listen to you talk. So what I have done is started to write scripts, and then I want to go through and just go theorem by theorem how you would understand this. So I'm hoping to start that around June, and when I do, I'm going to announce it on the Enochian group. Dan was very kind when I mentioned to him I was doing this. He said he'd announce it also. So it's just going to be a going theorem by theorem through the monad, basically. I know now it is easy to translate between languages or to do it in a really kind of shallow way. But the trouble is when you're not just translating from Latin with the monad, because he's making all kinds of inside jokes. He's making references to things. He's treating letters as shapes. So I'm just going to explain some of that. And then I want to use that to go forward and talk again about how to set up an Enochian temple. Thanks for asking, Tufan.
It sounds great. And we would definitely like to support your course.
Okay.
And Teresa, I must say you inspired me tonight because, I never really even had any sense of grokking what the hieroglyphic monad had to do with actual alchemy. But when you started talking about, well, from the point to the line to the sphere, the inner exercise of using the discipline of a sequence of visualizations, which lead up to the ultimate process of hypercube implosion, that's exactly what inner vision needs to do. It has to implode before it becomes psychokinetic, obviously, which is the ultimate alchemy of fusion. So actually, you inspired me there a bit.
Oh, well, I feel honored. I mean, it's the hardest thing, I think, for most people who are studying ceremonial magic to do. Now, Alan, who just say hello, he's here now. Say hello, honey. There he is.
Hi, Alan.
Hey.
Lovely harp there. Nice.
Hi, Ellen.
Good to see you. Hi, Tufan.
So he's incredible at visualizing things. It's taken me like a lot of practice, but if you just sit and you get so that, I've been told, well, people can't visualize in 4 dimensions. Well, you can. It's just, it takes a lot of practice. And, and if you are just casting a pentagram and you're putting it in 4 directions, well, there are crutches you can use. And I had to use every one of those crutches because I spend my days looking at text, or used to. But the more you can build up those shapes, the more that you can do things that are, everything from remote viewing to
Yes.
opening up a hypercube.
And the sort of flatland vision of that is now we know the physics of how Rabbi could make a golem. The optical cortex is literally a plasma donut. And by holding one Hebrew letter at a time in clarity in your optical cortex, you're literally setting the direction of the wind of what tilt angle the shadow of that plasma donut is as a torus of plasma. And then if you blow those donuts into a series of smoke rings, it's actually the physics of how you'd make an atomic table, for example. But
Here's a fun John Dee story for it with the seal of Amet. Dee knew Hebrew a lot better than people realize. You can treat that symbol as a golem. That's another whole discussion. But then the golem, the Prague golem, has on its forehead, right, Amet, life. And you turn it off by taking off the aleph, and then it's met, it's death, and so it's shut off.
was interesting. But then when you and Alan did those visualizations in Turin, and the wind blew and the atmosphere in the room would blow the doors off. What were the 4 directions there again?
Just north, south, east, and west.
No, but I know, but the words.
Well, we were doing we were calling the archangels Raphael, Gabriel,
Yes.
Michael, Ariel, sometimes called Uriel.
Yes.
And
I mean, when they say you blew the doors off, they were quite literal in the sense that the reason the air pressure changes in the room.
Well, then you know the magic's working, right?
Yeah.
The air pressure drops in the middle of the room. You got charge collapse, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's literally charge collapse. It's like the day I watched Susan Ambrose call the wind with the Hopi corn. It really tells you that if that's so. Back to your process of visualization, that is the heart of the matter here, is building those muscles. That is the physics of creation. Absolutely. And if you have anything more to say about how you build those muscles, that is relevant.
Well, it's sort of like how you get to Carnegie Hall, right? Practice, practice, practice. I mean, I see a huge difference in the things I can do now compared to when Alan and I met 20 years ago. He came into this life with some skills I don't have. And I wondered early on, like, well, I'm doing this, but I'm not doing this as well as he can do this. But you practice and you can.
He could visualize a sequence of shapes, and he could see the same shapes in the shadow of that room many minutes later, just like he built them. It was really impressive, I must say.
Because I had built them in Yesod.
He says it's, could you hear him there? He says it's because he had built them in Yesod.
Yesod. Yeah, I mean, in that case, thoughts are literally like buildings. They're shadows of plasma domains that have enough symmetry that it's like the Sufi making an echo. The echo.
By the way, in that one file that I put about the squaring of the circle in sacred space, that all started with a drawing of Vincent's, which is trying to how do you map things from, all right, 4 directions in Malkuth, you go up to Yesod, and it's a very complicated drawing. So anyone who's into, doing this and practicing this, I would encourage you to take a look at that and start to see how you can flip those shapes around and understand it. It also explains why you get 5-6 ratios and why you associate usually the pent with the microcosm and the hex with the macrocosm and that sort of thing.
The hex, we remind that the 7 spins is the 7 spins of the tetracube, and incubation literally means to stabilize a hex, which is powers of 2 ratio, which is why snowflakes are perfectly good for stability and terrible for implosion. The opposite of that would be the pent, which is implosion, which is literally ancient witchcraft and all of the above.
Yeah.
So, well, and just a reminder here that the major references for tonight's conversation is Terry's Facebook group, which I've been involved with, which is Alchemy Ophanim, and then the original reference articles at goldenmean.info/Ophanim. Tufan, have we done enough to try to respond to questions here, do you think?
We have 3 more if we have enough time.
Oh, please, let's play. a little.
Tamislav asks, where can I read more on this type of visualizing? And that was 4 minutes ago.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, join the Facebook group, and if you can't find it in the files section, ask, and I'm happy to talk to you about it. But just from a practical point of view, think of like if you're reading a work of fiction, do you build up those scenes in your mind? I mean, how well, if you close your eyes and think of a place that you've been to, can you recreate that place? When I'm casting a pentagram in 4 directions, now you can do that just in a Yesodic space and call a direction magical east, but let's say we're doing it in real Malkuthian, east is east space. Well, can you do that and make a box? Can you bring the top and the bottom together? Can you rotate the energy around? At a certain point, when you're building up the visualizations, you start feeling that energy run. Now, it's easier if you're on a ley line or something like that. But
because compression is enabled. In other words, the plasma gets thicker. And so if you have access to sacred space, it's helpful. That's why there's all these instructions, which Terry, I'm sure, has resources also about creating your own sacred space, your altar, where you regularly do these things, because the plasma there then is more ready for you to. But this is the inner muscle, and this is life or death in terms of the physics of creation. It's what Steiner was so clear. You got to teach those kids to visualize a rose clear enough that the room fills with the smell of roses, or they've lost out on the physics of creation. And by the way, if they spend too much time in front of their screens when they're young, they lose that inner muscle, and this is a tragedy. So yeah, next question, Tufan. Thank you.
Terry, are the alchemical maps of symbols and shapes simply a visual snapshot of the actual implosion of the toroid perceived from a point in space and time as the observer?
That's a fantastic question. I think just if you are able to ask a question like that, then you can sort of work through those shapes and see. I would say sometimes yes, sometimes no. And when the answer is no, that's when you have this astral hygiene problem I was talking about with Dan earlier. Does that make sense? I hope.
Yeah. In other words, if you get enough implosion working, literally pure intention, then only shareable waves survive the passage through center. That would be the theory. But also in practice, then that means
it's like you can have a Hebrew letter drawn in a certain way and do all the wonderful kind of things to it that Dan talks about and get absolutely nothing. Why? Well, it wasn't drawn right. So some of those symbols degrade over time, and that's part of the problem also with the symbols in grimoire magic. I mean, or Agrippan magic, say. The symbol worked really well once upon a time, but it degrades when it's being used by people that don't know what it is and just think, well, stick this non-coherent thing over your door and it will protect you. It's like, no, probably it's not going to protect you.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah, so there's the issue of actually seeing the connection to true life in the plasma shadows.
Okay, next one from Saraswati. Miss Moore, your wisdom, mannerism, voice, presence feel like a giant belated birthday gift from the universe, feeling very grateful to connect. My overly curious souls assured for the day. Can you share your website, contact information, courses, group meditation offerings? I'm very called to explore your offerings and dive deeper.
Oh, thanks. Well, the main one is that Facebook group I put in there, and earlier up in the chat, on the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition, Alan and I published a fair number of articles on Enochian. Nancy Turner and I had a translation of the hieroglyphic monad. So those links are earlier up in here, and hopefully from this June on, you can find some of this on YouTube. Thank you so much for saying that.
And not to mention your recent book about Kelly and...
Oh, well, that is Vincent's book that I edited. Yeah. And it is a
short,
yeah, a A Short History of the Rise and Fall of Sir Edward Kelly. I think I have a copy around here.
It is an amazing book about how
Well,
karma weaves through history, I must say, and the alchemy of it all.
Here is that one, and it is still on Amazon, I believe. Although we're going to put out another version of that in probably next year sometime with the play that Dan knows so well. That Vincent was writing a play about Sir Edward Kelly that was due to be performed the day that he died, and so we've got a copy of that, and we'll have it in the next edition of that book.
Oh, the play's the thing in which we'll capture the. So we have to put on that play.
Oh, I think it might be dangerous to put on that play. I don't want to put on that play, but I'll read the play.
Unpack the alchemy of it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I think this comes to Dan. Jane Hera asks, as well as doing this on ley lines, can you do it on dragon lines?
On what kind of line, sorry?
Dragon.
Dragon.
Oh, dragon lines. Well, you know, we were talking about how for the Aboriginals, the songline dreaming track, which might cross a whole continent, it's obviously living plasma. And in that case, in many cases, it was a family pet. Okay, so that particular family that inhabited that songline for 100 miles or 1,000 miles in all directions would respond to their dreaming. This was a family pet. And there is a compression algorithm that we're calling the dragon current here. They were dragons. They're real. Dragon in the Ice Castle. David Uguero wrote the book. And he could see these dragons leave the earth and fly. Literally, these are plasma entities. And in today's turning point rain-making ritual here in South France today, the local expert who knows the name of all the local dragon currents arrived and explained to us the requirements the dragon current said. And by the way, guys, it's raining outside right now, and the ground is breaking. Anywho, so yes, no, dragons are very important, and they represent just a compression array that enables communication with living intelligence for sure. Yes. Anyway. Okay.
We don't have any more questions. Thank you.
Oh, that was a happily ever after, Terry. Well,
well, thanks for having me, Dan. It's been a lot. It's always fun to have a chance to sit and talk with you.
Yeah, it's so wonderful, and we need to use your resource more. You're wonderful, and I would like to do something more someday, more on the alchemy theme here. Sure. You know, implosion, alchemy, mummification, all the things that Vincent taught about alchemy. It's just we need to do something more. So more to come.
That would be a blast.
Yeah, and let us know how we can help you.
Oh, okay, thanks.
So thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. We had some fun.
Thank you, Terry. That was so good. Thank you.
Oh, thank you all. This has been awesome. By the way, the question about how to connect if not on Facebook, you can shoot me an email and I'll put my email in there, but that's, there we go. So, anyway.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Blessings. It's been wonderful. We're going to miss you. Hang around. We talk soon, huh? Blessings.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.